Welcome to the Leadership and Learning Podcast with Dr. JBT, where we dive deep into the art of leadership for emerging and advancing leaders. Whether you're just starting out or looking to sharpen your skills, this podcast is your go-to resource. We'll explore real-world scenarios, actionable solutions, and expert advice with insights drawn from Dr. JBT's own experiences and interviews with seasoned leaders. If you're serious about growing as a leader, you've come to the right place. Welcome back to Leadership and Learning with Dr. JBT. Today, we're tackling one of the hardest judgment calls in leadership, the pivot. Every leader faces moments when the current path isn't working. Maybe the strategy isn't landing. Maybe the market shifted. Maybe the team is struggling. And the question that sits in front of you is deceptively simple. Do I stay the course or do I change direction? Get it right and you look decisive and smart. Get it wrong? Pivot too soon and you abandon something that just needed more time. Pivot too late and you've wasted months or years on something that was never going to work. Today, we're going to dig into both failure modes, the leader who waits too long and the leader who moves too fast, and try to find some practical wisdom in the middle. Let's dive in. Before we talk about timing, let's define what we mean by a pivot, because the word gets used loosely, especially due to COVID. We heard the word all the time. A pivot isn't a minor course correction, okay? Adjusting your messaging, tweaking a process, swapping out a vendor, those are refinements. A pivot is a more fundamental shift. It's changing what you're doing, who you're serving, how you're creating value, and sometimes all three. In the startup world, the pivot has almost become romanticized, a sign of agility and self-awareness. But in established organizations, it's often treated as an admission of failure, which is part of the reason why leaders wait too long to make the call. The reality is that a pivot is neither heroic nor shameful. It's a leadership decision like any other, and the quality of it depends almost entirely on the timing and the reasoning behind it. So let's start with when leaders wait too long. This one is the more common failure mode, just waiting too long. There's a powerful psychological force at work here called escalation of commitment. Once a leader has publicly backed a direction, invested resources in it, and built a team around it, the cost of admitting it isn't working feels enormous. So instead of pivoting, they double down. They tell themselves and their teams that results are just around the corner. They look for data that confirms the strategy is working and discount data that doesn't. The signals that a pivot is overdue are usually visible long before the leader acts on them. Customers are disengaging. The team is quietly losing faith. Competitors are gaining ground, but the leader keeps returning to the original thesis. This should be working. Instead of asking the harder question, is this actually working? Blockbuster is perhaps the most cited example in business history. By the mid-2000s, the signals were everywhere. Netflix was growing, customer behavior was shifting to home delivery and eventually streaming. Blockbuster's leadership made several partial attempts at change, but could never fully commit to abandoning the retail store model that had built the company. The pivot they needed was structural, and they waited until it was too late to matter. They eventually filed for bankruptcy. This case highlights that it wasn't that Blockbuster lacked information. It's a leader's inability to act on information that threatened the existing identity of the organization. The lesson, waiting for certainty before pivoting usually means waiting too long. Let me say that again. Waiting for certainty before pivoting usually means waiting too long. By the time the data is unambiguous, your options are narrower and your competitors have moved in. What about when leaders pivot too soon? This is the other failure mode. This one gets less attention, but it is equally dangerous. Some leaders are wired for movement. They're energized by new ideas, easily bored by execution, and quick to interpret early resistance or slow results as evidence that something isn't working. The problem is that most good strategies look like failures in the early stages. Adoption takes time. Behavior change is slow. Markets don't move on your timeline. When a leader pivots too soon, a few things happen. First, the team loses confidence. not in the strategy, but in the leader. If you've changed direction twice in 6 months, people stop investing fully in the new direction because they're not sure it will be the last either. They're expecting you to pivot again. Second, you never find out if the original strategy would have worked because you didn't give it enough time. Third, and perhaps the most damaging, you develop an organizational habit of treating every obstacle as a reason to change course rather than a problem to solve. New Coke in 1985 is a fascinating case here. Coca-Cola responded to Pepsi's growing market share and taste test results, reformulated their flagship product. How many of you remember the New Coke? It was a dramatic pivot away from a 99-year-old recipe. Within 79 days, they reversed course and brought back Classic Coke. The original pivot was made based on data, blind taste tests, that didn't capture what the product actually meant to people emotionally. They moved fast, and they moved on incomplete understanding. The lesson? Early struggle is not the same as strategic failure. Leaders who pivot too soon often mistake the difficulty of execution for a flaw in the direction. How do you know? How do you know? This is the question every leader once answered. How do you know when it's time? Guess what? There is no formula. But there are some practical questions worth asking before you make the call. First, are you dealing with a strategy problem or an execution problem? These require completely different responses. If the strategy is sound, but implementation has been weak, inconsistent, or under-resourced, a pivot abandons the right answer for the wrong reasons. Dig into whether the strategy has actually been tried before you conclude it isn't working. Second, what does the data say versus what does your gut say? Leaders who pivot too late often have a gut that's rationalizing. Is your gut rationalizing? Leaders who pivot too soon often have a gut that's impatient. Neither gut feeling is reliable on its own. Triangulate the data. Talk to customers, frontline employees, and people who will tell you what you don't want to hear. Third, are you pivoting towards something or away from something? The best pivots are pulled by a clear opportunity. The worst pivots are pushed by discomfort with the current situation. If you cannot articulate what you're pivoting to and why it's better, you may just be fleeing. Think about that. Fourth, have you communicated the reasoning clearly? A pivot that your team doesn't understand really just creates chaos. A pivot that's explained. Here's what we learned. Here's what's changed. Here's why this new direction makes sense now. This builds rather than erodes trust, even when the change is hard. The pivot is one of the truest tests of leadership judgment. It requires you to hold two things in tension simultaneously. Enough conviction to stay the course when things are hard, and enough honesty to change course when the evidence demands it. The leaders who do well share one quality above almost everything else. They're more committed to the outcome than to being right about the original strategy. When those two things come into conflict, they choose the outcome. That's the standard worth holding yourself to. The outcome. Thank you for listening to Leadership and Learning. If you found this useful, share it with a leader in your network who's facing a pivot decision right now, because I guarantee you someone in your circle is sitting with exactly this question today. This is Leadership and Learning with Dr. JBT signing off.